The first talk is by Geet George from TU Delft. So Geet will give a talk on shallow and deep convection. Geet is interested in taking questions during the talk, so you can get the microphone during the talk and ask questions. This talk will also have two parts, shallow and deep, so he's happy to take questions after the shallow part, right midway through the talk also. So Geet, yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. Yes, so like Jim said, we don't have to do it in a way where we have the talk first and then the questions. We can have questions in between. And the talk is structured so that we discuss mesoscale processes in the shallow convection first, and then we go into the deep. So we can also take a break for shallow convection and take questions pertaining to that, and then go on to the deep. Yeah, so we've already had lectures on convection and the large-scale circulation, and those are very nice building blocks to show what I want to talk about here, which is how mesoscales play into shallow and deep convection. There are many different processes when we say mesoscales. So I won't talk about all of them, but I'll go into details about two of, so one each for shallow and deep convection, to show how complicated these processes are if we are not going into subgrid resolutions for climate models. And most of what I'll say here are borrowed from studies of Rafaela Vogel, who's at the University of Hamburg now, Martin Janssens, who's at Wageningen, and Julia Windmiller, who's at the Max Planck Institute for Meteorology. And I had the joy of being co-author on most of those studies. So like I said, we've already looked at the general circulation of the atmosphere. Essentially, you get a lot more heating at the equator, and so there's net transport towards the poles, and you have these three cells. In the tropics, we have the Hadley cell, which I'm sure we've looked at quite a bit during the large-scale circulation talk. If we cut across this part and just see how the different factors affect cloudiness, there are actually, you can think of two convective regimes. One is where you have the ascending branch of the Hadley cell. This is the deep convective regime. You have the deep tropics. And then in the balancing subsidence, you have the shallow convective regime. So with that, people started making these large-scale factors that can be helped to predict how much cloudiness there can be. And so usually you have things that tell you how strong the circulation is, which is omega 500, so vertical velocity at 500 hectopascals, or omega 700. You'll have factors like atmospheric stability, because that can be a strong indicator of what type of shallow clouds we see. If the inversion is very strong, then you're likely to see stratocumulus type clouds. And as the inversion weakens, these clouds are more broken apart and scattered, and they're more shallow convective clouds, cumulus, trade wind clouds. Sea surface temperature is a strong driver, as are surface winds and fluxes, and precipitable water in the column. So these are very commonly used factors, which we could say are beyond what the climate model's grid scales are. So you can have a lot more control with these large-scale factors. But subgrid, and where the convection processes are going on, and where there's more turbulence and mixing, that's not of course represented in the grids of the climate model. So then what do we do there? Oh, sorry, before that. So subsidence stability and cloud regimes show up also very well in the climatology. So if you look at the omega here, you find that near the equator, where we expect the ITCZ a bit north, you have this negative omega at 700 hectopascals. That is the rising motion, and strong subsidence on the balancing side of on both balancing sides. That also shows up in the total liquid water. So there's a lot more clouds in the column when you see where you have the ascending branch. and much less in the shallow cumulus. It gives you an indication of how deep these clouds are. And based on the EIS, so EIS is an estimate of how stable the layer is. EIS stands for estimated inversion strength, but that's a good indicator to tell you what type of clouds you will have. And so you'll see where you have strong EIS, which is a more stable atmosphere, you have a greater cloud cover, and that's usually because you have stratocumulus decks. And where you have weaker EISs in the subsiding regime, you'll find the cloud fraction to be much lower, which are these scattered shallow cumulus type clouds. So, so like I was saying, going from the large scale, if you want to include the mixing processes, which are particularly within the grid, this paper by Boni et al. 2015, which talks about cloud circulation and climate sensitivity, they put it very well when they say that the convective mixing processes, although we know that they are important in explaining how the rainfall is distributed, and we know that they can affect the sensitivity estimates of both climate variables, so temperature projection, or explaining how rainfall would change. We need to understand convective mixing processes, but because of the resolution that we are running these models in, they cannot be represented very well. So, for instance, we miss things like convective scale organization. This spatial organization of convection can be very important in understanding how the processes will change in a warmer climate. Or about processes related to how the distribution of clouds happens in the vertical. And one example of seeing how the difference in the way that these convective mixing processes are represented can lead to differences in climate sensitivity is shown here. So we'll just look at the left half first. So MPI-ESM is a climate model where they tried to run it in two configurations, which is high sensitivity and low sensitivity. And this only means high sensitivity of cloud fraction or high sensitivity of clouds to the ECS. And same with the IPSL model. And what we see is that a change between the low, so the change in cloud fraction between the low sensitivity and high sensitivity models, that shows a change so that shows a strong positive or negative feedback. So this is how the clouds will change with warming. And naturally, then that comes to the question of if we represent these processes well, the subgrid processes, how the mixing affects clouds, and therefore how the change in warming is predicted. Can that help us solve cloud feedback uncertainties? Can we reduce these uncertainties? So, so then we start to look at these subgrid scales. But when I say subgrid scales, what do we mean? These are the mesoscales. And this is from a paper in 1975, which is now kind of a good standard to go back to and always place yourself in what scales we are talking about. And if you know the GCM and climate models, they have a grid spacing of around 100 kilometers. So where these processes fall in the mixing processes would be in the mesoscales between 20 to 200 kilometers. So here you have spatial scales, and here you have temporal scales, and we fall somewhere in this meso-beta scale. So 20 to 200, you have many different processes that they mentioned, like low-level jets, squall lines, inertial waves, cloud clusters, and orographic disturbances. But these are not represented within this 100-kilometer grid spacing that we have. One thing that, so with the mixing is how the mixing takes place, how the circulation happens, and that also comes under this 20 to 200 kilometers. So that's different from this large-scale circulation that we talk about, which GCMs do a fairly good job of. And very likely because of this lack of representation of mesoscale processes, we find that again and again through the different generations of the CMIP experiments, the response of low clouds or predicting how low clouds would change with climate change has always been this big source of uncertainty, which then also reflects into the climate predictions or how temperature is supposed to be. So we'll look first at shallow convection. We'll pick one of the mixing desiccation problems that was hypothesized to be hypothesized to explain this. And so what we see here is, like I said, this large spread in CMIP models where they cannot agree on the sign also of how low clouds should change with warming. And there's this theory which says, well, it's not a theory, it's tested. We've looked at the models, and what seems to happen is that models which have a strong mixing desiccation, they show a strong positive feedback. So what do I mean by mixing desiccation? In a warmer world, if you have increased mixing, so you have increased mass flux, for example, it's compensated by an balancing entrainment. So an increase in mixing is an increase in entrainment, and the efficiency of the entrainment mixing to dry out the boundary layer is more than the surface fluxes can provide in this warmer world. So that leads to a drier cloud layer, which means you have fewer clouds, and therefore it leads to more warming, and that's a positive feedback. So if you have strong mixing desiccation, that's a strong positive feedback. And the ones that have weaker values, they have a weaker mixing desiccation representation in the model. But coming to observations or checking if this strong mixing desiccation is in fact working in nature, the Eureka field measurements went out and tested or measured mass flux and vertical velocity at this 200 kilometer scale for the first time. And from those measurements, what we see is that there's a strong coupling of clouds and circulation. So now when I say circulation, it's the vertical velocity, or fluctuations in vertical velocity are the circulation. So any change in the mixing or in the mass flux is not just balanced by entrainment, but there's also a component of the vertical velocity that's in the equation. And if we just assume this to always be constant and the balance to just be between these two, then we see the mixing desiccation happen. But if there is a compensation also through vertical velocity, the vertical velocity, unlike entrainment, does not change the properties of the boundary layer. So there's not as much drying happening as it would be if there's only entrainment that's working on this.
Geet. Yeah. So in the left-hand side plot from climate models,
yeah,
the representation of vertical velocity is present.
Yeah.
There's a mixed layer model, but there's also some forcing from vertical velocity.
Yeah.
Is the argument that whatever models are doing, and in reality, when there's a large difference, is that the argument?
Yes, exactly. So I'll come to a slide which shows that. The argument is that changes in mass flux should also show changes in vertical velocity, or other way around. But what we see in models is that it's very heavily, so clouds respond to the thermodynamics a lot more than than what the observations show. It's more, there's a lot more dynamics-driven cloud control. So this cloud-based vertical velocity, which is our indicator for circulations, that has been shown to regulate cloud-based cloud fraction. So this is from the same paper I was talking about in the slide before, where they suggest that there's a strong cloud circulation coupling. So on the left, on the x-axis, there's mass flux, on the y-axis, there's cloudiness. You see this relationship, which is just sort of positive. It's not a strong linear fit, but if the mixing desiccation would have been right, then we would have seen a negative trend, right? So with increased mixing, we would have lower cloudiness. And the other hand, 2 years before that paper was published, from previous field experiment, we showed that the vertical velocity at LCL, or just at the cloud base, is a good predictor for how cloudiness at cloud base can be determined. And along with the observations, these two, idealized LES models also suggested that if you have fluctuations in vertical velocity, you also see changes in the moisture variance. So it's not just a very direct control of there being more mass flux and more clouds, but also it changes the moisture of the environment that these clouds are in. Yeah, so what the idealized LES show, and what we also then found in the observations, is that if you have rising air, that's likely to be a moister column, and a subsiding air would be a drier column, and it feeds off that cycle. So the moist areas get moister and they grow larger, and the dry get drier. And this comes to the question that Vishal was also asking. If we compare how the observations, so from the field campaign we had, if we compare that to how the models are performing, if we look at clouds in all these CMIP6 models, all the blue and the red markers are different CMIP6 models, and the black dot is the observations. On the x-axis, it's you can just think of how correlated the clouds are with the dynamics, or with W, or mass flux, and how correlated they are with the thermodynamics. So the humidity, or the variance in humidity. And what we find is that they are more correlated with the thermodynamics than they are with the dynamics. So the observations are quite to the right. You see it's almost 0.7. It's a strong control that's being indicated with the dynamics. And at the same time, if you look at the variability, or so how many different circulation regimes the clouds can see, or what space in circulation is being provided to the clouds, in the observations, the variability in vertical velocity is much higher, and none of the models reach that such a variability. So the variability itself is much lower, in fact, for vertical velocity. But if you look at in the humidity, it's much larger, which leads us to think that there's a much stronger control of thermodynamics on clouds in the models than vertical velocity. So, which if we had also seen that in observations, that's fine. But at the grid scale, what really works is the control of dynamics. And I say control of dynamics, but we'll see soon that it's not so much the control of dynamics on clouds as it is the other way around. So what we looked at then with the measurements was, so I'll give a rough idea of how we measure the vertical velocity. We fly an airplane at around a 200-kilometer diameter circle, and along the circle we dropped sons. So these are, think of the same sensors that you have on radio sons, but they're coming down with the parachute. And what we get is horizontal wind profiles all along the circle. So you can also think of doing a Gaussian integral, and then you get the horizontal divergence at any level. We did a regression. It's the same for both. So if we have horizontal divergence at every level, then you can just integrate and then get the vertical velocity. And that's how we measured the W. So here I'm just showing the divergences. This is the mean divergence through the whole campaign. It was a month, but flights were every 2-3 days. So there are 12 days, and every day, so every box is 1 day. And for every day, you find there are 6 sort of lines, colored lines. And each of these colored lines show one flight. So one circle is shown by one line. Right? And typically, the flight was where you had 3 circles, so a circling set, and 2 circling sets, which were separated by an hour. But those are just details. We don't need to go into that. The divergence values, as you'll see, vary quite a bit from one day to the other. And now you can think of these values. These are mesoscale values. It's averaged over 200 kilometers. The airplane takes around 1 hour to do the whole sampling. Comparing each circle or each day even to the mean throughout the campaign, the order of magnitude itself varies. So the mean throughout the campaign is around 10 to the power minus 6, right? And these colors are at the 10 to the power minus 5. So there is a large variability in W compared to what we think of this traditional subsidence regime. And it's also not always subsidence, even if it's the classic trade winds scenario that we keep thinking of. So you find that there are days where you have strong convergence. These are all ascending motions. So what we found that with different days, you have different divergence signatures in the subcloud layer, so in the bottom 700 meters, and in the cloud layer, which is 700 to 1500 meters. And then there's always a dipole between the two layers in divergence. And we speculated that these are probably circulation signals that we're seeing. So on some day, the aircraft saw moisture columns, convergence in the subcloud layer, and divergence in the cloud layer. On other days, we measured divergence in the cloud layer, subcloud layer, and then convergence at the cloud layer, which was much drier. So we saw the signal almost every day out of those 12 days. And we wanted to check if these are actually circulations in space also, or just different branches that we sampled over different days. And for that, we took the help of the reanalysis. And if you look at the reanalysis, we find that, so here the colors are only where we saw this divergence dipole. So that helped us confirm that, in fact, all of these colors that show different branches of the circulation, it is very widespread throughout the domain, and it happens every day. So these are just 12-hour snapshots along a whole month. We call this shallow circulations, SMOCs. But it seems that you have at least 45% of the area covered with such circulations almost the whole time. If you plot a distribution, on average, a 10 degree by 10 degree domain is covered by, like 58% of the domain is covered by such shallow circulations. And the impact of such shallow circulations on clouds or the other way around is not something that is represented in that grid. How they interplay with each other is also not known, but now at least we know that all the variability that we saw in W, this variance from the mean, but also the inter-day variability, that can be explained by these circulations. So naturally, we wanted to go beyond the field campaign and see how, if we can get statistics of these shallow circulations and explain the mechanism of these circulations. So this is work by Martin Janssens, and what he does is that he compares these circulation features in the ICTS measurement, which is a satellite that gives surface wind. And if you have surface wind in a spatial domain, you can get the divergence at the surface, which is a good proxy for the cloud-based vertical velocity. At the same time, looked at very large domain LES runs, which also were forced with realistic conditions. So these are not periodic boundary conditions, to investigate how these shallow circulations or these SMOCs form. So what we see here then is these pink dots. They give the vertical velocity estimate from ICTS measurements throughout the domain, not just one value, and compare that to what the vertical velocity looks like for the LES. And they seem, so with ICTS we only have one value, and they seem to match there quite well, which is this blue line from ICON and the green line also from ICON. They just show the 25th percentile and the 75th percentile of subsidence. Comparing that to the field observations, the circle measurements that I was showing, that also seems to fit quite well in those lines, which suggests that ICON is probably getting these the distribution of the vertical velocity in the right scales. So if we want to then try and explain how these circulations are working, what we did is we broke the buoyancy budget down to its components. So what we're seeing on the left plot shows values for the strongest divergence clusters. So Q4, the 75th percentile and on the divergence. And the Q1 is 25th percentile and lower. So the strongest convergence and the strongest divergence. What does the buoyancy budget, how does the buoyancy budget look different for both? And we look at the tendency of the theta LV. So it's liquid water theta V, but you can just think of this term showing buoyancy. So how much buoyancy can be explained by these terms? And the terms are, so there's a storage term, there's vertical advection, vertical flux convergence, precipitation, radiation, and so on. The important ones here would be, because we're trying to explain the vertical motion, is if we can get to explain this vertical advection of the buoyancy term. Is there a question? Feel free to ask questions at any point. And yeah. Yeah.
We know the theta budget.
Yeah.
Of the
Yeah.
What is mean by buoyancy budget? How is that different from?
So with the buoyancy budget, we are, sorry?
How is that different?
Yeah, so the question is, how is the buoyancy budget different from the thermodynamics or just the theta? So within the LES, we also want to know how much of the water is being brought in by, so not the water, but how much of the buoyancy. So the buoyancy could be because of T or Q. What contribution of that is being brought through the different terms in the LES? So how much is the mixing playing a role? How much is the advection playing a role, and so on? Is that?
So you constructed a budget for G by theta.
Yes.
Theta prime.
Yes. So there's a lot more assumptions that Martin puts into this, and comes down to like a 3-equation derivation. But essentially, it's in principle that's what we did. And what we want to explain is how much vertical advection is happening because of this. Yeah. So yes. So the purple shows this vertical advection, right? And it's very nicely balanced by the combination of this flux convergence and the precipitation at different levels. So the flux convergence is just how much moisture is being brought into this level, and that's aided by condensation also at some level after the LCL. And as you go higher up, then it's not so much condensation, it's being evaporated, but the precipitation takes on this responsibility of heating. So if we combine this condensation and precipitation, just call it convective heating, these terms balance the adiabatic ascent or descent. And that seems to explain at least the buoyancy budget. But explaining that budget doesn't mean we have causation. Why it's or how this is forming is not explained just by a budget look. But what we can do is make an approximation for how stable the layer is, and then we can apply this WTG approximation. So WTG is the weak temperature gradient, is how much does the layer allow you to build up buoyancy differences. And for the case of the LES, it is quite stable, so it should not allow any buildup of buoyancy, which means that if we now break it down, so if we want to predict this vertical velocity, so W at mesoscales, then we should only need the vertical flux convergence and the diabatic sources. And so I'll explain it in a more simpler fashion, where if we have a stable layer and we have some perturbation of buoyancy because of convection, that buoyancy is not going to build up in that local region. Right? Because the layer is stable, you'll have gravity waves that will try to dissipate that difference. And so based on the stability and how deep the layer is, you can estimate the speed of the gravity waves. And for the case of our circulations, what we saw is that within 3 hours, or in a bit less than 3 hours, the area in 200 kilometer by 200 kilometer box should be smoothened out. So there should not be any more buoyancy fluctuations, which means that there's a contribution to the adiabatic term of ascent or descent, and that is how the WM can be controlled. So now we have also an idea of what is causing what. So if there is condensation, if there's the latent heating that I was showing with condensation, precipitation, that drives gravity waves, which causes changes in the buoyancy remotely. Within 200 kilometers, it's not remote in the sense of teleconnections, and that builds up the circulation. So if you want to just predict this WM from just these two terms, and we plot it against what is actually happening in the model, they sit very well. So within the LES also, this seems to be what's happening. And if we compare it with observations also, then it seems to explain the spectrum of vertical velocity within the mesoscales. So the solid line shows the vertical velocity variance, so how vertical velocity values will change through different scales. So the solid line shows it for the LES. The dotted line shows it only for the regions where I mentioned that there were dipoles. And so the smocks seem to be explaining all of the variability within the LES. So in the LES, we know, okay, that's working. Now we apply the WTG model, right? So just based on how much convective heating there is, can we explain the vertical velocity? And that also seems to match on very well till we go to very large scales, and then the scaling doesn't work anymore. So at mesoscales, the WTG model explains the same vertical velocity variance as in the large domain LES. And like I had said, we can also get an estimate of this cloud-based vertical velocity from satellites. If we also plot that on there, it goes, so the scaling stays the same again till the point you have this larger scale influences coming in, where larger scale circulations also probably play a role. And that vertical velocity variance cannot be explained by this WTG. So it seems like if the WTG model works, then all you need are condensation terms, precipitation terms to explain how the vertical velocity should vary. And so that if that is represented better within the model, then you can get better representation of vertical velocity, which then also can translate into how the convection is organized spatially, and leading to environmental background terms, if it's drying or not, and so on. But of course, then we are left with the question, if condensation is what is driving the vertical velocity, what is deciding where the convection is happening, or what sets this condensation anomalies? That's a whole talk in itself, so I won't go into that, because I just wanted us to get an appreciation for how much the mesoscale processes need to be represented within a grid. Right? So that's what I have for shallow convective part. If you have questions, I'm happy to take that now, or I can also.
Are there any student questions?
Yeah. Thanks, Geet. That was an interesting talk. Do you have any observations of the radiative cooling rates from the flight observations, like especially the cloud top ones?
Yeah. So as you're thinking, radiative differences might be driving the circulations. Yeah. So that was our first guess. That's what we went first looking for.
Okay.
But the radiative cooling rates didn't differ too much between the different branches of the circulation, and even when there was these differences, it wasn't the sign wasn't right. It wasn't cooling where you would expect to have the descent. And then we also checked that in the LES. So before the last domain LES, there was a run with idealized LES, no radiative forcing, but you still saw the same circulations, which is explained by the convective heating anomalies. So for shallow convective cases, it seems like the radiation or the difference in radiative cooling doesn't play a big role in driving circulations. For the deep convective cases, it's been shown that works.
So I think you said that the WTG is going to be valid at 200 kilometers for about 2 hours?
Yeah, 3
right?
hours, yeah.
2-3 hours, okay.
Yeah.
So I was wondering then, what's the time scale for these shallow mesoscale overturning circulations?
Yeah. So it depends also on the length scale a bit and how it's forced, but usually it's 8 to 10 hours. So in the observations we saw it being consistent over 6 to 8 hours. It's not changing, but it's a fixed point that we can take. For the LESs, it could go on a bit more. So especially if it's a larger scale convergence object, extratropical forcing or something, and then it could be for 24 hours or more. But of the order of 8 to 10 hours is what usually these.
I have a question too. You're using the WTG approximation quite low in the atmosphere.
Yes.
We kind of think that it might be a little tricky because you feel the surface friction at this altitude, but it seems to be working.
Yeah.
So is it that surface friction is not, so you clearly don't go all the way to the surface where we would be troubled, but
so after around 800 or 700 meters, you see this starts diverging from the vertical.
So essentially you're saying that the upper part of the boundary layer is fine. You don't feel too much the surface friction.
Yeah, what we wanted to explain is this variance at cloud base, and that seems to be explained by this. But of course, as you said, the friction starts showing up, all the turbulence starts showing up, and then this won't hold anymore as you start going lower. Usually what is done is you just think of having a linear scale brought down to 0, and then that's the vertical velocity. But I think Martin also showed a better way of predicting this based on the mixing. Yeah, but it's true. You cannot go very low with this, so you cannot get values there. But if you want to explain vertical velocity at cloud base, which is what these circulations are showing, then this seems to be a good approximation. Yeah. So let's go on to deep convection, and with deep convection, we'll talk a bit about the Inter-Tropical Convergence Zone or processes within the Inter-Tropical Convergence Zone. Traditionally, we've always looked at how the whole zone interacts with factors outside. And so you can think of that as the outer life. But how does the ITCZ organize itself? What is the inner structure of it? That has been missing. Or actually, we haven't really thought about this for very long. But recent observations from ship campaigns, they suggest that as opposed to the traditional view where you have a single line of convergence, so you have the northern winds and the southern winds converging somewhere close to the equator. Instead of that, what we usually have is a dual convergence system. So you have winds coming in from the south and slowing down, and that causes a speed convergence. So there's a convergence band here, and then in the north is the northern hemisphere winds, the northern trades and these winds that have crossed the equator from the south, they converge, and that's a directional convergence. So we have these two convergence bands, and understanding actually how this is set up can help get the inner structure of the ITCZ, which might help us enhance these global climate predictions. Or, I mean, just the fact that we cannot agree on the ITCZ's response to warming, that also probably comes from the fact that we haven't represented the subgrid processes very well. So this is a hypothesis that was presented, that there is a difference between there's a southern convergence and a northern convergence. And I don't know if this video plays, yes. So this is for 2-3 days, and you find that this band of convection, and so it's from geostationary images. At night you don't see this, there's a band of convection at the north and at the south, and very often we have very clear sky between the two, displaying these two bands very clearly, right? And so that's what we look into. We'll try and describe if we can get the features of this double convergence lines of the ITCZ. And if you pick out the south and north edges and look at where they are positioned, this is for July and August over 20 years, and over the Atlantic. So they just average over 3 degrees longitudes over the Atlantic basin. And we find that there's a distribution of the south and north edges. The width usually is around 500 kilometers or 5 degrees, which can be quite lower than that, but it's often higher. So it's not really subgrid, but the processes that you need to get those convergence bands or the moisture variance within those bands would fall under this mesoscale definition. And if you look at it in terms of how far apart it is in moisture, so if we set a threshold for the ITCZ, let's say 48 kilogram per meter square is where the ITCZ starts, then how does the north and south edge vary between this? So the southern margin of this column moisture, let's say as we go from the south to the north, the first point where we hit 50 kilogram per meter square is shown at 0. And then you'll have the southern edge somewhere within 2 degrees, and the northern edge, it changes based on which latitude you're looking at. So yeah, so there is also some variability between how the south and north edges are placed with respect to each other and with respect to the moisture contours itself. So if we then look at how these edges show up in different variables, now what we see is 2 vertical lines, right? So the left one is the southern edge, and the right one is the northern edge, and the scale has been normalized so that the distance between those is always 1, and everything else is scaled accordingly. And we find that, for example, with the meridional wind, there is this speed change happening. So there is a drastic slowing down of the winds at the southern edge, which we were calling the speed convergence. And right around the northern edge is where it changes sign. It goes from positive V to negative V. So it's where you have the southern and the northern winds meeting. And that's how we were also thinking of the edges. It shows up more prominently in the divergence. So you see these strong minimas where we expect the south and north. So this is by definition, this is how we had defined it. And therefore, this is how it shows up also for convergence. These two strong convergence bands. With the precipitation, what we see is it favors the southern edge a bit more. And so these 6 plots, what we're seeing is for boreal summer, July, August. But Cape is preferred, so it's greater on the northern edge. Depending on which longitude you look at, the value changes quite a bit. Coming to January and February, it's similar with the V and the divergence, but precipitation is favored more in the northern edge now. So there are differences in the latitudinal profile, but also between seasons. So yeah, here. Yeah. So that shift is because conditions north of the northern edge and south of the southern edge also change with between summer and winter. So yeah, so what Julia Windmiller, it's her work, what she did is she looks at the Cape and Sin, also north and south of these edges, so beyond the edges, and tries to explain based on the stability conditions, as well as the wind directions. So between boreal summer and winter, the conditions south of the southern edge change, which probably, we don't know, which probably drives this difference in precipitation, favoring the northern edge in the boreal winter. Yeah, so, but this is a description of what the edges look like, how the precipitation and Cape change, and also other factors. So we looked at SIN, SST, surface fluxes, how they change between the two edges and within. So we're trying to describe this inner life. And one of the things within this ITCZ, or within the edges, within the inner life, is that the winds can be very calm, or what we can call as doldrums. And they are very crucial in understanding if the tropical circulation are represented well in climate models. So there's a study that looked at very high resolution simulations and found these calm winds and how they organize convection. And if you're not representing that in climate models, then we're not representing the organization very well. So if we look at measurements from buoys on the ocean, there are these black distributions, or if we look at how the winds are distributed within these, so these contours show the edges, the south and north edges, and the darker the color, the greater the occurrence of the frequency of occurrence of low wind speeds. And we find that there is a strong maximum right in the middle of these two edges. So that's where we expect very low winds, calm winds. In this case, the calm winds are defined as being less than 3 meters per second. And if you look at how these wind speed events evolve, if we normalize them to the start of the wind speed, so when it falls below 3 meters per second, to the end of the wind speed. And in this case, it's normalized to the median time of all these low wind events, which is roughly 9 hours. We find that there is a strong precipitation drop as soon as there's a low wind speed event. So this is the event starts when at the buoy you start seeing very low winds, right? And it stops when the buoy starts showing winds greater than 3 meters per second. And at those times, there's no precipitation happening. So at the left and right, these are just two different longitudes where the buoys are. What you also see is that the air temperature slowly starts increasing when the winds drop. And that's, for me, it was a bit counterintuitive because now you don't have fluxes. But it's probably the restoration from the background state where you had this cooling because of precipitation. So it starts getting closer to whatever the background should have been if there was no precipitation. And those are also shown by these dotted lines, which is the monthly averaged the temperatures. And you also see a slight signal in the shortwave radiation indicating that there's probably differences also in the cloudiness between low wind regimes and the higher wind regimes. So this is probably divergence playing a role, but that cannot be tested just from the buoy measurements. So there was a field campaign called Orchestra, which the bigger idea was this. There were multiple sub-campaigns, but percussion was the sub-campaign that looked at. So they flew the circles again, like I was explaining earlier, to check if the low wind speed events are actually correlated with divergence or not. But this is not pedagogy. This is very ongoing research, so I won't talk about any of that. But the doldrums are something that the doldrums, as well as the edges and their interplay, that is something that needs to be represented better in models. But of course, before that, we also need to understand these mechanisms. So I'll finish up with the large scale picture that we have. But within all these large scale features, there are mesoscale processes that need to be added, such as this double convergence here or circulations here, which can improve our current estimates of the cloud feedback uncertainties and climate sensitivity estimates much better. And it's not just for that, it's also, I mean, it's the way that we represent them in models, both coarse and in the high resolution models. So yeah, that's roughly how important, or how we can begin to appreciate why we need to incorporate the mesoscale processes within the large scale setting to get a better idea of both shallow and deep convection. Yeah, thanks.
So,
4 minutes.
yeah, so I just wanted to ask that these double convection bands that in the Atlantic ITCZ, so does these two bands get active in the same time? Like similar something occurs during Indian summer monsoon, but whenever you have that southern like oceanic convergence zone active, the northern part of the like over the Indian landmass, that band is not active. Like it's more like it's mostly related to that BSIO and MESO thing, that whenever the southern flank is active, the northern flank is not. Is there something similar in the Atlantic, or these two are kind of independent and you have simultaneous convection occurring in the same time? Or
Yeah, so they're not independent, but they're also not at the same scale as the convergence bands that we see during the monsoon there. So I know that there is this, the activity of one of the band depends on the, well, not depends, but it is associated with the other in terms of these intraseasonal oscillations. But for the Atlantic, at least there was no clear, if the southern edge is active, that the northern would not be, or any. We also haven't looked at that so this is also one of the question marks. So if, what drives there to be the two bands, and sometimes you also see them actually just show up as one band. So, and so what causes the, the failure of this two band thing? Yeah.
okay, yeah.
I don't have a better answer. It's how these two bands interact. We still don't know.
Yeah. Thank you.
Hello, can I have a question from the online?
Oh, online. Oh, yeah.
Am I audible? Sorry.
Yes, you are audible.
Yeah, this is Mohan from NCMRWF. I have a question on this double convergence regarding this ITCZ. What we have seen in the global models is that the global models has a long-standing issue of representing the double ITCZ in the models, and now I think all the seasonal prediction or the climate models try to improve their models to, they're saying that the double ITCZ is an issue. It's a long-standing bias, and then they try to improve the models to get the convergence zone properly. So if the observations is showing as a concurrent measurements or the robust measurements showing a two convergence zone, I mean, how do I take them like in the models? Is that an issue, or it is with the scenario? It is now it is an evident that we have a double ITCZ. I don't know.
So no, that's not kind of, so the two bands of convergence that we see here are still part of this single. So in terms of what we say double ITCZ in the climate models, these two bands would fit within this northern ITCZ. That's that bias is still, it's still a bias. It's still a problem because it doesn't match what we see with the precipitation bands and observations, or any other signal that we would like to look at in observation. So those are different scales. Here, the two bands are more about how the ITCZ itself is organized internally. These are more 200, 500, 1,000 at the most kilometer differences between the two bands. And for the double ITCZ problem, that's a much larger scale over the equatorial Pacific and much southern convergence zone. So these are, yeah, those, I can see how double can be a bit confusing with it being mentioned for both, but they are different problems, I would say.
Yeah, thank you.
I don't know where to look when it's an online.
Hello, sir. So in this study, they have calculated ITCZ width using the edge locations, distance between southern and northern edges.
Yeah.
So there is one thing called northern limit of ITCZ. So can we say that ITCZ width is a distance between northern limit and southern limit of ITCZ? It is based on precipitation.
Oh, that's you mean the northern limit that you were saying is based on precipitation?
Yeah.
Yes. So there are many different ways people define the ITCZ or the edges of the ITCZ, and that really comes down to the purpose of that investigation and what. So yeah, the definition should serve the objective. I'm not saying in the sense of cherry picking the definition, but it should make sense for what is being studied. So in this case, what we wanted to see is the convergence bands, and so the definition is based on the meridional wind of how we take the southern and the northern edge. But if you're more interested in, for example, I think Soumyadeep looks at organization within the ITCZ, and so you look at a moist margin, and you define the edges based on the total column moisture, right? And like you said, people also do that on precipitation thresholds. So, yeah, this is one way you could get the width of the ITCZ.
Hello, sir. I just wanted to ask, like, how can we distinguish between deep convection and shallow convection in terms of microphysical property of clouds?
Oh, I mean, very simple answer could be, so in terms of microphysical properties, you mean how the microphysics are different in the shallow and deep regime? Okay. Not at all an expert on that, but so one obvious thing is that for the shallow convection clouds, you don't need to care about ice microphysics. That's and ice, the frozen. So ice microphysics are, I know, a real pain for modelers. It's also warm microphysics, but especially ice. Maybe there's a person who's better here to answer the question of how, let's say, warm microphysics is different between deep convection and shallow convection. Do the microphysics schemes, are they tuned separately for deep and shallow convection, or is it no? So there probably is a difference. I don't know. Yeah, it's a good question. Answer is no one knows.
Just a super quick comment. Your temperature recovery.
Yeah.
Basically, I think it's just simply because you have, first of all, clear sky, and secondly, with low winds, you effectively have you don't have any wind-driven mixing, so your effective mixing layer depth drops down to the order of a meter. It gives you a diurnal cycle capacity of around 3 degrees. So what's happening is you get enhanced shortwave warming of the sea surface temperature.
Yeah.
And so then the boundary layer temperatures are basically still coupled, even though you've got a low wind regime. So you're right that the surface sensible fluxes would not be as
it won't be as active.
great. So the coupling between the boundary layer and the surface is not as tight, but nevertheless, because you've got a recovery of the sea surface temperature with the clear skies and a very shallow effective mixing layer depth, you get a recovery of the SST, and then the boundary layer goes with that. So I think that's where your temperature recovery comes from in the doldrums.
Yeah, no, I agree. So there's, I mean, most likely the insulation being greater.
It's that more than rainfall evaporation. I think that's the key driver.
Yeah, it's tough to say. So I think the source would still be that. I mean, because even if we don't have such strong winds, there's still some heat fluxes that are increasing the boundary layer temperature. But why is that not then happening before? What's preventing this?
Because that's when it's raining. It's cloudy, no? You don't have the enhanced shortwave.
Oh, so as you're saying, only insulation would be.
Sky, it's two things. You've got clear sky in the low wind regime, and you also got an effective mixing ocean mix.
Yeah.
How do you say? You don't have a deep mixing layer. You're not mixing heat down. You've got a shallow mix layer, and so you basically get recovery of SSTs and the boundary layer temperatures go there. I think that's the primary driver.
I agree. That would be the driver, but just because it won't be very efficient because the winds are not. I think it would be great to quantify. I mean, I'm quite convinced that what you're saying is the difference, the insulation. But just it would be good to put numbers and see how much, because the winds can be really low. I mean, this is more averages, but it can go below 1 meter per second and really.
There's a couple of papers that I can show you that.
Look at. Okay. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you. Let's thank Geet. In the interest of time, I'm not taking more questions, but